Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast with Michael Becker and Paul Peebles. During this program, you will hear interviews with real-life successful investors who will share their stories and provide useful advice on how to acquire, finance, and operate apartment complexes. Now, here they are, Michael Becker and Paul Peebles.
Welcome to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Peebles, National Underwriter for Old Capital. And joining me typically would be the governor of the great state of real estate in Texas, Mr. Michael Becker, but he is on another due diligence assignment. So in the podcast today, we have Ricardo Hinojosa with Old Capital. Ricardo, how are you?
Fantastic, Paul. It's good to be here.
So Ricardo was one of our top producing loan officers for Old Capital, and he'll tell us a lot of good stories about how he puts transactions together. And so we have one that I think is going to be exciting to listen to, because people ask me all the time, Paul, how do I get into multifamily? You know, I have maybe 2 or 3 or 4 single family homes, or I own some Airbnbs, and now I want to make the transition into multifamily. And Paul, how do I do that? So today in the podcast, we're going to talk a little bit about making the transition over from, buying your own house to now I own that apartment building down the street, not just by myself or a big corporation owns it, but just a group of people that are like-minded individuals that have decided to buy a larger apartment building than just a 4-plex or an 8-plex, that they brought it to the next level. So we're going to talk a little bit about the journey of how to get into multifamily real estate, and we want to learn a little bit about the background from these folks that I think that you'll enjoy and listen to their story. And Ricardo's going to talk a little bit more, and he's going to give you more of a knowledge of their journey. So I want to welcome to the podcast Keith and Shannon Knight. And the Knights, how are you?
Good morning. We're great, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Paul.
So we've known the Knights for a number of years, and I wanted us to kind of turn out and just kind of tell their story so that you could understand it. And if you could be in their shoes, eventually maybe a year or 2 from now, I want you to listen to how they did it. So I'm going to turn it over to Ricardo, and let's start the conversation.
Fantastic. Well, Keith, Shannon, again, thanks for joining us. Met you guys several years ago, I think back 2019, and these two really hit the ground running. They've had a couple of great acquisitions since then. So let's get to know you a little bit. I guess let's just start off with a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump into how you got into real estate and multifamily.
Okay. Shannon, why don't you go first?
All right. So I grew up in Kingwood, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston, and then went to college at Texas Tech University, Reckham, and met Keith Knight there. So that made it worth going to Tech altogether. And then graduated from University of Texas at Arlington with my graduate degree and became a professor of education. So I retired from that in 2016 and then got interested in real estate, particularly vacation rentals. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But Keith, you want to give your background?
Yeah, so I'm a native Texan, and I was raised in a small business farm branch operation. And I went to Texas Tech, like Shannon said, is where we met, and taught high school for 4 years, where I worked on a master's degree and finally completed the CPA exam, and worked as an auditor for about 3 years or so for exploration and production companies in oil and gas. But the bulk of my career was about 25 years working as a tax software sales consultant and setting up big tax systems for large multinational organizations, really all over the U.S.
So Shannon, you mentioned vacation rentals. Was it your first dive into real estate? And how did that come about?
Yeah, so we had friends doing single family homes, and we learned about the depreciation and all the tax benefits from that. And Keith was making a great salary, doing what he did really well. And we needed a way to offset the taxes on his income. So we started looking into single family rentals. And then I thought, is there some way to make bigger money with a house than just a traditional rental? And so I was thinking about how we had stayed in vacation rentals in Colorado and Florida and really enjoyed them, and wondered, what would it be like to rent one out? So it was easy to go on these vacation rental sites and see what they charge for nightly rates. We understood mortgages because we had a house with a mortgage and utilities and all that. So it's easy to do the math and figure out we can make a pretty good profit if we bought houses in strategic locations and rented them out year round to vacationers. So the spot we chose was near Disney World. That's the number 2 vacation rental location in the nation. Number 1 is the Great Smoky Mountains. So we chose Disney World. It was familiar to our family. And we bought a house in 2016. It did very well. The tax benefits were so good that in April of 2017, when we discovered this and saw we were going to get this giant refund on our taxes, we bought a second house 4 doors down in the same neighborhood. And those 2 houses put our oldest son through college out of state tuition. And I operated those. It was a great way to cut my teeth on property management and customer relationships and all of that. And I think it was a great transition for us into multifamily because we kind of learned the ropes with a couple little houses first.
Wait a second, Keith. Are you telling me that you're the CPA, you're the tax guy, but your wife found these houses and the ability to depreciate these homes and cash flow, and she has an education degree. You're the tax guy.
Yeah.
So what was up with that?
So in fairness, and I do want to go a little bit deeper on what Shannon's saying here, because first off, I had done cost segregation is a big topic in real estate, right? So I had done some cost segregation studies on a big scale with big companies like Johnson & Johnson and stuff. So I knew just a little bit about that. But when we got into the vacation properties, we did do a cost segregation on the first house, which is one of the reasons why we got such a deduction back, and we were able to get enough for, frankly, a down payment on that next house that Shannon was talking about. But what I really want to say here is it really teed us up because Shannon self-managed those houses from Texas on her phone. When people would check in, for example, the houses had pools on them. Hey, can we get the heat turned on the pool? No problem. Just fired it up on the phone and Shannon would do it. So that teed us up for our multifamily in the sense that, when it came time to be in multifamily, we were very familiar. Shannon was very familiar with doing everything electronically.
Yeah, I'm familiar with all those VRBOs around Orlando. As you know, the big National Multifamily Housing Council meeting has been in Orlando, and we usually would go down there with 4 or 5 people, and we would rent a house with 4 or 5 different bedrooms and bathrooms, and with a pool in the back, and barbecue grill, and brand new house, and it was just absolutely wonderful. So I can imagine all the families that come from all over the United States that want to stay close to Orlando, to the theme parks, whether it's Disney or Universal, and they're looking for a home that's maybe a lot cheaper than getting 5 different hotel rooms that you could have just one house that had 5 different bedrooms. So I see the progress that you've started to make into multifamily by doing this type of stuff. And was there an app that you guys used on the phone that you thought was a pretty good deal?
Yeah, so we listed with VRBO. I think they call it Verbo now. And so that was the communication app. And then I had an app for heating the pool. I had an app for the AC thermostats. And then we would email or text the guests, and I would. So, and that was the thing. I learned immediate communication was really appreciated, and that followed through as we began self-managing our own properties. But as we owned these rentals and we would talk about them, our friends that had joined a real estate education group would tell us about their experiences and what they were learning about multifamily. And it was so familiar to what we were experiencing with our vacation rentals that really piqued our interest. And so they invited us to go with them to what they call a case study. And we got to hear about properties that were owned by members that were there that we could talk to. And they discussed with the whole group property that they owned, how it was going, the plans for rehab, what kind of returns they were expecting on that property. And so it really got us interested in learning more, and eventually led to us joining this group and beginning our journey in multifamily.
And that group was Lifestyles Unlimited?
Yes.
Fantastic. So what appealed to you most about the group? Like just going in, you're already cash flowing, you're already getting you're already seeing the benefits of real estate. What appealed to you most about that specific group?
So there are a lot of different factors that appeal to us directly, and just kind of on the foundation of those vacation rentals. First off, that was a difficult decision to kind of pivot off of that onto a multifamily arena, because we were making about 16 to 18% on those vacation rentals, year over year. Like Shannon said, we put a kid through college and now sit tuition with them. But what really appealed to us about the Lifestyles Unlimited group was first, the education of how you can get into a multifamily property, and it's really a business. The vacation rentals is more kind of the residential. You get that cash, which is great, but the asset itself is not valued like a business. And I had gotten long enough, I guess, in my career where I was working directly with some of the senior leadership in the organization. We always consistently talked about EBIT and EBITDA, right, which is earnings before income tax, depreciation, and amortization. Well, within just a couple of hours of sitting in on the Lifestyles Unlimited education courses, I quickly learned that the NOI, net operating income for your real estate, is basically the same thing as EBITDA, and it's valued, that values the business the same way that the corporations are valuing businesses. So I connected directly on that. So I could immediately see how this is basically a small business that you could take on and then grow the asset in terms of value, and then obviously make the money with that. Plus, you could pull in investors, and you get to know, specific people that can help you in terms of teams, like you guys, for example, from a lending perspective, SEC attorneys, and then of course just a variety of people that are, vendors, as well as just passive investors that have been in real estate for a long time.
So you joined in 2019, is that right? You started getting educated?
Yeah, actually 2018.
2018. Okay.
And then that's when we started learning about that we could be deal sponsors, or in the group we called a lead. And that piqued our interest even more, because we kind of like being in control of what we do with our money. So we're a little bit control freaky like that. So we started learning more about how could we own one of these with investors, one of these apartments, and make great money for all of us. And this group provided us the roadmap. And then also every morning I'd put on my makeup and listen to Old Capital podcasts. At that time, they were all new to me. So I had a new one to listen to every day for over a year. So Paul,
that is a very smart lady you have there.
I know.
Glad that we were part of that journey.
Yeah, Paul's voice was in my bathroom every day for a year at least. And it was reinforcing what we were learning in our real estate group. I was hearing the same terms, the same outcomes for people, the same good results. And so it really all gels together. If you pay attention, you'll keep hearing the same things over and over again regarding multifamily. And then it just becomes second nature because you hear it so much.
So upon getting educated, you jump in. How long did it take you to land that first deal? So why don't we talk about that process and how you found that first deal?
So how long did it take us? Let's see, we joined in August of 2018. And then basically a year later, we closed on the first lead deal. So we did some passive investing in between. By the time we got through the education, and frankly, just getting the finances arranged, the personal finances arranged so that we could actually invest in the deal, and then started to search for the deals, then it took us about a year to get in.
Did you sell the vacation homes, or did you keep those for a while?
That was part of it. We did sell the vacation homes. Yeah.
Okay. Even though you were cash flowing high teens on those deals, you saw the opportunity, and I imagine it was the opportunity to scale up and run your own business. That was the next step for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would say that scale up is kind of the path that we've been on in the past, 4 or 5 years or so here. That's what we've been trying to do, is just to kind of grow and grow and grow. And that was obviously the natural next step from those vacation rentals, is to get into multifamily. And like you said, scale up.
So tell us about that first deal. Let's learn about how that came about.
I'll give you the high level, and then Shannon, why don't you talk a little bit about how we actually really got to get into the weeds of how we found that deal and how it's kind of off again, on again. But it was a portfolio deal, which is a combination of 2 different assets for a total of 40 doors. It was in Fort Worth on 2 different properties. One was off of Camp Bowie, which is in the Cultural Arts District in Fort Worth. Just a beautiful property, a beautiful area. It's just kind of where the hip and cool kids live, right over there, really sweet spot. The other property is about, I don't know, 5 miles away or so. And it was across the creek or across the river, I guess, from the Fort Worth Zoo. And this property was built in 1927 and it was pier and beam, beautiful property. The residents would talk about how sometimes they could hear the hyenas and the lions growl from the zoo across the creek, So it was just really peaceful and great, real close to TCU. Anyway, so they were super great properties. But Shannon, talk a little bit about how we found this deal.
So one of the Lifestyles Unlimited realtors brought this deal to us, and we toured the property, both properties, loved them. And there was a call for offers, and we were ready to make our offer. And we found out a California buyer had made a really great offer. And so the properties were no longer available. So of course we were disappointed and this was spring of 2019. Mm-hmm. So we just kept looking and looking. And one day, Ricardo, you may remember this, you went with us down into Dallas to tour a portfolio of just horrible, almost slumlord-like properties. I think we looked at 5 or 6 and they were scary and awful. And in one of them, we were standing in the living room and they had the air conditioner was off, probably didn't even work. So we had the front door open and the back door just so we didn't all melt. And the resident who lived in that apartment comes in and says, "Why are you in my apartment?" And we all looked bug-eyed at him. And Ricardo was the smart one. He leapt from the back door all the way out, halfway out into the backyard. Because he knew this guy might be armed or want to harm us. And the rest of us just stood there like dummies looking at him. And then, of course, the owner's representative reminded him that they were giving tours today, and he calmed down right away. But Ricardo can jump really fast and really far, but he needs to.
I've been in enough of those to know when it's time to get out.
Yeah. So we went home that day really disappointed because once again, here were all these properties that we thought maybe one of them would work, and it did not. And I got on the website for the broker that had these 2 properties we had tried to buy before just to see did they have anything new. And there they were. They were on the website. I thought, well, that's got to be a mistake. And the Lifestyles realtor calls me at the same time. And she said, "What did you think about those awful properties today?" And we laughed about them. And then she said, "Hey, the 2 properties you wanted in the spring are back on the market." So we jumped at the chance. We made a really great offer and we got the deal and we closed on those properties. I think we started the process in June and we closed on them in September of that year. So that's a good lesson to everybody. That's something that you think you want, that you think you've lost, might come back around to you. So we keep that in mind every time we have a deal that doesn't work out for us. It might come back to us.
Yeah, those were beautiful properties. And let me just paint the picture in somebody's mind. So one of the properties was probably built in the 1960s or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
Just a beautiful property. That property for the ownership group had won apartment of the year, probably about a year or 2 prior to that. And that person that was selling the property had hit his mark of what his returns are. And they had done a beautiful job of kind of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again and waiting for the next group to come in and kind of bring it up to the next level. Yes. Because when that person that you bought that property from, when they bought it a couple of years prior to that, again, we kind of know where all the bodies are buried here in Texas, all the ownerships that have owned these properties. That person that owned it before, not the people that the Knights bought the property from, the seller before that, they had never been in the property in like 7 years or 10 years. And so the property really had gone down. So the group that had bought it and did a great job of rehabbing it and making it an apartment of the year, the Knights came in and just brought it to the next level and pushed rents up and had a lot of happy tenants on that property. Nice little property and a great pocket niche neighborhood, places that you'd love to live right next door to. There wasn't a bunch of apartment buildings. There was some beautiful $1 million homes like right next door. So where tenants were probably paying $1,500 a month in rent, the person that owned the house next door was probably paying $5,000 or $6,000 to have a mortgage payment. And then the other property that they bought, which was right next to the zoo, like an old 1920s property, but it was like 3 stories. And it was just magnificent, very historic. And people who would live in that property had lived there for years and they loved it. and it was well maintained. And so the Knights came in there and brought it to the next level too, and had done a great job and in a really historical area of Fort Worth next to the zoo, as they said. And I'm not going to say they got lucky, but they had two properties. I think was a good transition to go from having a house in Orlando to having these two nicer properties, getting their big toe into the bathtub to kind of figure out if they like the water or not. And I think those two properties were a good stepping stone to going into their next property. So before we leave this property, Ricardo, was there anything more that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think you hit it. I think a lot of times when we get new investors reach out, and we get that question a lot. What's the ideal property? And this is one that, again, was right down the middle. It's a safe deal. It was a stabilized deal in a good location. It was well taken care of, but it still had some value. I would imagine you guys saw this as kind of a hybrid deal, something that's stable, but there was still value there on the bone.
Yes, and actually, it was a perfect property because, like you said, Paul, I mean, it was teed up really great, and actually, a Lifestyles Unlimited person had done the rehab on that property. We were able to come in and we did some things like we added washer and dryer to the units, which increased the value of the property, and we put in some smart thermostats and just improved the rents, and also we just raised the rents because the area was so strong. We were able to increase the rents in the area and really really drive the value up on the property.
And then Keith mentioned this earlier, but the fact that they were able to build their team with that first deal, we were able to get them non-recourse agency financing on their first deal, which is not very common. And the reason we were able to do that is because of their team. They had a key principal with them that signed on the loan that did have the experience, right? Because with agency financing, it's not for newbies, but if you have a team with experience, we can get that done. That was a big plus, non-recourse agency on that first deal. Now, talk about the exit on that deal. How long did you own it, and how did it end up?
So we owned it. We owned it for 30 months, and let's backtrack a little bit. I mean, we bought that in the fall of 2019, September of 2019, and then 4 or 5 months later, COVID hits. Right. And I'm going to go back to what I said about the vacation rentals, where Shannon was really, on board with all the technology, because we had converted everything to leases were all electronic. Everything was all electronic, which really helped us out a great deal when it came time when COVID hit. And I think we released one person from a lease who couldn't get into, who couldn't pay the rent anymore. He lost his job because of COVID. He was a restaurant person, but we quickly replaced that. And then we didn't have any vacancies at all with that property. But we'll get a little deeper on this, with the next property. But we just took advantage of the compressed cap rates in the fall of last year. We looked at that, and I guess the spring of last year, a year behind on that. We took advantage of the compressed cap rates, and we sold it in 2.5 years instead of the 5-year plan. And we were still able to return a 20% annual rate of return to the investors on that. And, we can kind of get into the reasons why, because it coincides with both properties. We sold both properties last year for basically the same reason. So we'll kind of wait on that for the next property.
That's not bad at all. You were able to push rents, take advantage of the cap rates, and deliver great returns to your investors. That was the stabilized deal. Let's get into deal 2, because that was a little more heavy lifting. Why don't we talk about Patios of McKinney? The second deal you acquired. Talk about when you purchased it, how you found it. What did you like about that deal?
All right. So Patios of McKinney came our way. It was actually at a different name. And we found out about it in the summer of 2020, again, brought to us by a Lifestyles realtor. It was off market. So the seller was just waiting for someone to make a good offer, and that's who would get the deal. So we toured it. We liked what we saw because we live in McKinney, Texas. We know the demand for housing. We know it's an area that's constantly being improved, especially on the east side of McKinney. And so we saw the opportunity to take this property to not just one level, but 2 or 3 levels up, from a Class C to right at a B+. And we had confidence we could do that because we live in the same area. And we drive back and forth to church and see all these historic buildings that are being renovated. They keep the beautiful historic charm. of course, modernize the inside. And so I just had a vision for this property right away when we saw it. Things that were unique about it, every apartment was a one-story apartment, no upstairs neighbor, no stairs to go up, 12-foot ceilings in the living rooms, fireplaces in every apartment. And most importantly, every apartment had its own private patio, and it was a huge patio, like a 10 by 10 at least on every apartment. And especially during that time, that was the height of COVID, summer of 2020, and people were wanting outdoor space and they didn't have to intermingle with other people. And so we could just see right away that this property had huge potential. So we made a good offer and we won that deal.
Ricardo, for people who are not familiar, this property is in McKinney, Texas. McKinney is a suburb of Dallas. It's probably about 200,000+. So it's a beautiful suburb just north of the city of Dallas itself and Dallas County. Again, how many units was this property, Ricardo?
60 doors, 60 doors. And it was set up in there were fourplexes, correct? I think, and you had mentioned you guys rebranded it to the patios of McKinney, but it had some generic something fourplexes was the name.
Uh-huh.
So they were set up in fourplexes with a bunch of space, a lot of green space.
Yeah, it was Brookwood fourplexes.
Brookwood, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it. And the deal hadn't been touched. I mean, I remember walking it and you knew there was opportunity, but what you also knew is that it was going to take a lot to extract it. I mean, big money. Talk about the rehab budget on this deal and what you had to do to take it to Bright.
I can tell you the rehab budget number right off the bat because I remember it because you're right, it was huge, right? It was $1.64 million rehab budget.
On 60 doors.
On 60 doors. That's right.
I don't have a calculator, but that's closer to $25,000 or $30,000 a door.
Something like that.
Usually when you buy a property, and it may be 1970s or 80s properties, you're going to put $5,000, maybe $7,000 a door just to update it. Mm-hmm. So when you put that much money into any one deal like that, that really is talking about bringing the property to the next level. So that's really amazing. And were you guys up for the task to do that much rehab to the property? And what kind of rehab did you do?
If you could see it, we changed it. So, and even behind the walls, because there was galvanized plumbing and a lot of that was leaking. So we'd open up the walls when we rehab the bathrooms, change out the plumbing to PVC, change out all the cutoff valves, all the boring stuff. But it's the stuff that keeps you from having ongoing maintenance issues. And then all the pretty things. We did the vinyl plank floors, granite countertops, stainless appliances, really great tile backsplashes in the kitchens and tile surrounds in the bathrooms, upgraded the closets. We would go in a non-rehab unit and they had these closet doors that were floor to ceiling. They don't even make them anymore. And they would fall off the track so much, people would just have them leaning up against the walls in their bedrooms. So we reworked the closets to have, standard size doors that wouldn't fall off the track and look really nice. And we really just visited the Class A properties in the area, took photos and took notes of what they were including. And we tried to do exactly the same, knowing that because of the age of the property, we couldn't ask for the same rents as the Class A properties, but we came in very close. In fact, most of the units, we raised rents $650 or more.
Holy cow. So let's turn out a little bit of that. So you have 60 units. Did you do all 60 units of the rehab, or did you just keep maybe one or two as classics? Or how many, Keith, did you guys wind up doing on that property?
Yeah, we did 40 of the 60 when we came to the realization that, kind of the same thing I talked about with the Fort Worth deal, that the cap rates were compressed and it was time to take advantage of that. So we still had, in other words, we'd done 2/3 of the property. We still had 1/3 of the property left to go.
So you kept a lot of meat on the bone for the next buyer to come in. And you kind of proved up your strategy that you took a property that probably hadn't been touched in 40 years or so, or ever. Did it have the green shag carpeting and some of in the orange appliances?
But it did have green shingles. that so we literally painted the green shingles, figured out that you could paint shingles. That's a thing. That's a true thing.
Wow. So talk a little bit about how you took the rents from where they were when you bought the property to the time that you sold it. And just take, was it a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom? How big of a rent jump did you have after spending $27,000 and $30,000 a door on each unit?
So I acted as the leasing agent on this property. So once we had a unit rehabbed, we got it advertised on our website, apartments.com, all that good stuff. People would come out and tour. They loved what they would see. They'd come in and say, oh my gosh, look at this patio space. They'd walk in the front door to this 12-foot ceiling living room and say, wow, this feels like a home. And they immediately wanted to lease up. So because they loved what they saw, it really was a very easy lease up. So we just told them, what the rent was, and they didn't even blink at that. We were right under those Class A rents, so they could see that they would get something as nice as the Class A offerings in the area, but for a couple $100 less. And away we went. So the 1-bedrooms went from $850 a month to some of them $1,450 a month. Our 2-beds went from $1,100 a month to $1,800 a month. And our 3-bedrooms went from $1,350 a month to $2,000 a month.
Holy cow. Good for you guys. And I'm sure that the city was happy of all the changes you made, bringing in probably some higher quality tenants that were able to pay the higher rents on that property. And so I'm sure your limited partners were very, very pleased with that. So you managed the property on that one, Shannon?
Yes, we have managed all of our properties so far.
What'd you think about that? What'd you think about managing the property? So you're an educator, so you're a little bit of a disciplinarian. I'm sure your boys would tell you that. Tell us that. And so you transferred that great skill set over to the tenants. And so how'd you like being the property manager?
I liked it pretty well. It has its challenges, but so does teaching or any other profession. So you just work through them. But I really enjoyed getting to know the residents. I loved showing them an apartment that I was really proud of, and they'd move in and they were so complimentary. They'd tell their friends about it. And then, my skills from teaching and then vacation rentals really paid off because I continued with the great communication. We would immediately address any work orders, get maintenance right on it, great about answering questions right away or discussing whatever they had a concern about. So all of that, all my skills from previous professions paid off in property management. And I'm really glad that we self-managed these first few properties. It really has taught me everything there is from the prospect all the way to renewals. And also, I'm really happy that we chose a small property to do a deep rehab. I think we cut our teeth. We were the general contractors. So we had relationships with guys that knew tradespeople that know how to do all the things that are involved in rehabs. But Keith and I were the GCs. And so we cut our teeth on that property.
You guys had done it all. I mean,
we've done
GCs,
it all.
acquiring the property, asset manager, overseeing the tenant base, pushing rents up. And I bet just a hero to your limited partners that invested with you. So Keith, going back, how long did you guys hold this property? And again, past performance is no indication for future returns. How well did you do between us?
We did really well with this property, and I'm just super proud of, like you said, we improved the community. But direct answer to your question, 24 months is what we held the property. And it went from, we bought it at 140 a door and sold it for 206 a door with 20 units left to go. And it's a 1970s property. And there's so many different things that we learned that equates to a 31% annualized rate of return for the investors.
All right, Mr. Bragger, good job on that. I love hearing success stories, especially having the background of having Lifestyles Unlimited being part of your partners in this deal. Again, Lifestyles does not invest; they're just an education mentoring group that we like the way that they do things. And what I always say of what Lifestyles is, whether people say it is or not, is being an educator mentor. That is like learning, like fishing. They give you the pole, so to speak, and then they kind of teach you how to fish, and then they also give you the pond that you can fish in, and that is like the limited partners and be able to bring equity to the transaction. So they're not looking for, these large syndicators that go in, that they're looking to educate folks just like you or I that maybe have been an engineer, or like in this case with as an educator or a CPA, and get them to kind of understand how real estate is a good form of financial planning, not just stocks and bonds and 401ks, but maybe how you can use your IRA to buy real estate as a limited partner in too. So they teach you a lot of these things. And again, we have no financial commitment within Lifestyles, but we do and they've been around for 25 years. And in fact, they just recently had their expo up in Irving that the Knights were at. And again, how many people, Ricardo, do you think were there? Because people don't understand how big Lifestyles is.
Well, it's a massive group. I mean, I think, 30, 40,000 members. I don't know what the exact count is, but the expo is a several day event. It'll be here in Irving this year. And I'm sure there'll be several, 5,000-6,000 people there.
Yeah, it's always a large event. And so let's talk a little bit about future and what that looks like for you guys. I mean, you had 2 stabilized properties. That was your first go around with those smaller assets that you kind of cut your teeth on the multifamily side. And then you had a little bit larger asset that was a value added piece. What's kind of the game plan for the future for the Knights? I mean, what do you guys see in the next go around with multifamily?
So, like I said, the whole theme of us for the past few years here has been scaling, right? So we went from these vacation rentals to, like you said, these stable assets. And at one point, I was still at W-2 and Shannon was managing these properties, and she was managing 100 doors. And of course, the first thing you learn with that is, hey, there's a limit to what you can do, right? There's a limit to the scale you can have. So in June of last year, June of 21, I left corporate America and, worked with Shannon full time. And that was when we were in divesting mode. So we were selling the assets that we had. But, the intention here is we want to continue to scale. And we are looking for a property that's 150 to 200 units now to go that much bigger, where we can get staff or possibly a third-party management and help with some of the things and really implement some of the great things that we've learned in these assets, and then continue that growth for the passes and the returns, rather, for the passes. Our goal, and in this market, Ricardo, you and I have talked a lot this year. And our goal is to have a minimum of about a 20% annual rate of return. And that equates to a combination of, a good cash return right now for the passive investors, but also a good equity lift at the end of the project in terms of the sale.
That's great. So interesting stuff. Ricardo, any final words before we ask Shannon about any funny stories? Because she managed properties, and there's always a quirky tenant or a quirky story. So before we ask her that question, Ricardo, any final words or statements?
No, I think just to follow up really quick on what Keith was mentioning, these guys, they sold the patios. Keith left his W-2, and I remember you guys reaching out and, all right, we've got to ramp up. Talk about that process over the last year or so, because it hasn't been easy finding a deal in this market over the last 12 months. Talk about your process, what we've been working on, and that transition from W-2 to, hunting for a deal in DFW.
So, yeah, like I said, I left the job in June of last year, and that transition, when I first left, I thought, okay, great, I'm going to take over the world, right? Here we go. And I know you guys talk at Old Capital a lot about teams. We talk a lot about having the correct team in Lifestyles Unlimited. But I would say that, in conversations, Ricardo, you and I finally rolled into a weekly conversation to talk about what's going on in the market. And you had some great advice on, hey, know what you're going after, and then understand the market that you're getting into. And that was one of the big learning curves that we had at the patios, for example, because that heavy lift that we did on those units, I think could only be done, not necessarily only, but Collin County was ripe for that kind of a lift, right? We couldn't necessarily do that over in the Fort Worth property that we mentioned before. So understand those markets, understand the teams, and really just continue to communicate. I used to tell sales guys, look, if you go after a sale the same way that you did the year before or the 2 years before that, you're likely not going to have the same level of success because the market changes. And that's frankly what's happened. The market has adjusted and you got to adjust with it. So leverage on these loans is a bit of a challenge to pencil. And I think you and I, Ricardo, have looked at probably over 50 deals so far this year to find the right one. And, we're still looking.
Fantastic. You mentioned your sales background, and I'll point to that because I remember us having a conversation, and you were coming to us saying, how do we find the deal? How do we continue building our team? How do we scale? And I kept reiterating, it's about the relationships. You've got to really get out, build your right team, build the relationships. And I remember mentioning to you that you've got to really feel like you're bugging people sometimes, specifically the brokers. And I remember your reaction is that you basically said that's right up my alley.
Yeah,
and
that's not a
you were so
problem.
jazzed because that's what you do, and building relationships is kind of what you've always done. And I think that will go a long way in this business, by the way.
Yeah, and to get really specific, I mean, that is definitely not a problem. I'm used to calling people 2-3 times a day. I'm good at it. Ask Shannon. I can be very annoying. But no, after that conversation, I now have a call list, a call sheet like I used to have in sales of all the different brokers that are out there. And I've got everybody on a piece of paper that's just a quick access over here on my desk. And I can call brokers like, Ricardo, you're on speed dial. And, I call SEC attorneys. I'll call whoever I need to get an answer, and just not afraid to pick up the phone. But that's the way you do it. I've had lots of lunches with people, just continue the conversation, just keep talking. Always try to be front of mind for anybody that can bring you a deal.
All right, let's ask the question to Shannon about any funny stories, because I'm sure when you're in property management or you're an asset manager and you've been putting these deals together, you come across a funny story or two.
Oh yeah, I've got a lot of them.
What's your funny story for today?
The one I'll tell today really benefited us financially the best, so it's worth telling this one. At the patios of McKinney, we had a resident who was in the illegal pharmaceutical industry. And I would watch on camera, drug deals going down in the parking lot. This was not long after we took over the property and we're trying to get things turned around. And so he was very behind on rent. And I was able to prove in court that he had a job. I would follow him to his job in his apron and take pictures and all of this. And so I proved in court that he had a job. So he didn't qualify for any rent relief, and therefore he should be evicted. And the judge agreed. So of course he didn't go willingly. And we had to do a writ of possession, which is in Texas when the sheriff comes, posts a notice on the door that says you were evicted in court, you haven't left, and I'll be back in 2 or 3 days to forcibly remove you if I have to. So the day the sheriff comes, we have guys ready. We get all of his belongings out onto the lawn, sofas and TVs and beds and just everything. And maybe 2 hours later, I get an email from another resident whose windows face this property. And this resident owes about $5,000 in outstanding rent. And he was next on my list for taking him to eviction court. He says, "Hey, I just tried to pay my $5,000 of rent that I owe online and it cut me off at $2,500. And I said, "Oh, no problem. Tomorrow you can pay the remaining $2,500. It's just an issue with your debit card." But we laughed about that and said later, we should have thrown some furniture out on the lawn all over the property just to get people who were behind on rent to pay up.
There's a new sheriff in town. That is Shannon Knight and Mr. Keith Knight. So if people wanted to get more information about what you guys do, what's the best way for them to get in contact with you?
All right. You can get in touch with us at info@Knight, REIGroup.com, and we'll answer your email.
Fantastic. All right. Keith, Shannon, thank you very much. We appreciate you being on the podcast. Ricardo, thanks for keeping the conversation lively. We appreciate it. Everybody being here. Again, I'm Paul Peebles. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Old Capital Real Estate Investing Podcast. Please join us at oldcapitalpodcast.com to sign up for our weekly email updates. We'll see you next week for another great interview.